He had fought across North Africa. He had survived Rommel's retreats and the grinding desert sun. He believed, truly believed, that the Americans were soft. That is what they had been told. That is what made sense. So when German prisoner Ernst Miller was processed through a U.S. Army camp in 1943, he expected humiliation. Hunger, maybe worse. Instead, he found something that unsettled him far more than cruelty ever could have. He found abundance. And that quiet abundance did something to him, and to thousands like him, that no bullet had managed to do. Before the camps, there was the certainty. German soldiers in North Africa moved through the war with a particular kind of confidence, not the reckless bravado of men who don't think about dying, but the measured assurance of men who believe the mathematics are on their side. They had been told through official channels and through the quiet osmosis of ideology that America was a mongrel nation. Distracted, commercially minded, a country of salesmen, not soldiers. The Wehrmacht had torn through France in 46 days. It had pushed deep into the Soviet Union. Why would a nation of Hollywood films and automobile factories be any different? This belief was not incidental. It was load-bearing. It held up everything else: the willingness to keep fighting, the capacity to endure, the sense that the arc of the war still bent toward Berlin. And so German soldiers carried it with them the way they carried their mess tins and their letters from home. It was part of the equipment. Rommel himself had expressed measured skepticism about American fighting ability early in the North African campaign. The early engagements at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm it. American units, green and poorly coordinated, were pushed back with embarrassing speed. German officers wrote home about it. The Americans learned slowly, some of them noted. They are brave enough, perhaps, but they do not yet know how to be soldiers. That phrase, "they do not yet know how to be soldiers," is worth holding. Because what came next was not a battle. It was a breakfast. When the Afrika Korps began surrendering in large numbers in May 1943, roughly 275,000 Axis soldiers captured in Tunisia. In those final weeks, the German prisoners entered American processing centers, expecting the treatment that war, in their experience, tended to deliver. Scarcity, disorder, the rough geometry of captivity. What they encountered was organized, calm, and this is the word that appears again and again in prisoner accounts: bewildering. Imagine what he saw. A man who had been eating reduced rations for months, rationing water, watching the supply lines from Europe grow thinner and more unreliable, suddenly standing in a line where he was handed food. Not survival rations. Real food, white bread, which had become a near mythological luxury in wartime Germany. Meat, coffee. Some prisoners reportedly believed, at first, that the Americans were staging the abundance, performing prosperity, for psychological effect. That it was a trick. It was not a trick. It was simply what America could do. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed at the same standard as the detaining power's own rear echelon troops. The United States, alone among the major combatants, could actually meet that standard without straining. So they did. And the men who had spent years inside a system of managed shortage, where every calorie was rationed, where the state controlled what you ate and how much walked into American captivity and found the shelves full. One prisoner, in a post-war account, described the moment of receiving his first American meal as the moment he understood, in his body rather than his mind, that Germany was going to lose. Not because of tactics, not because of generals, because of this, because of the sheer, almost obscene normalcy of it. But this was only the surface of the unease. What came next went deeper. The food was unsettling. The scale was something else entirely. German military intelligence had, of course, studied American industrial capacity. The figures were known in the abstract way that large numbers are known written in reports, briefed to officers, filed and understood intellectually. But there is a distance between a number on a page and the lived reality that number represents. And for the German soldiers processing through American camps in 1943, that distance began to close. They saw American equipment, quantities of it that made their own supply situation already strained. Already the subject of private anxiety among German officers looked like something from a different, smaller war. American jeeps, American trucks, American uniforms that fit. The sheer standardization of it. The sense that behind every piece of equipment was a factory, and behind every factory was another factory, and that none of it was running short. General Erwin Rommel, in his personal writings, had begun to grasp this earlier than most. He wrote of the material disparity with a kind of grim clarity, noting that battles won on the field could be undone by logistics, and that the American capacity to supply was of a different order than what the Wehrmacht had anticipated. He understood, perhaps before many of his peers, that the war in North Africa was being decided not on the battlefield, but in the production schedules of plants in Detroit and Pittsburgh. But understanding a thing and feeling it are different experiences. The soldiers in the camps felt it. Remember what they believed at the start, that America was a distracted, commercial nation. Too soft for real war? Here is where it begins to break. Because what the prisoners were seeing was that the commercial nation had simply turned its commerce toward destruction, and it was very, very good at commerce. Hit subscribe right now, because what these men admitted next in their own words, in letters they thought no one would read, changes everything you think you know about what broke German morale. Do not go anywhere. American authorities read the prisoner mail. This was standard practice, expected by both sides under the conventions of wartime. What was not expected, perhaps, was the candor. When men believe their letters will be read, they sometimes perform confidence reassuring their families, maintaining the posture of the cause. But something about the camps seemed to dissolve that posture, at least partially. In censored but surviving prisoner correspondence and in post-war testimony, a pattern emerged that American intelligence analysts found striking. German prisoners were not broken in the way that propaganda had always imagined breaking. They were not weeping or raging or pleading. They were recalibrating. They wrote about the food. Yes, they wrote about the medical care, another Geneva Convention provision that the U.S. actually honored in full, including for wounded prisoners who received treatment in American military hospitals alongside American soldiers. They wrote about the boredom of captivity, which is its own kind of testimony. Boredom means safety, and safety, for a man who has been at war, is a radical and disorienting condition. But beneath the domestic details, something else surfaced. A quiet, reluctant reckoning with what America actually was. One pattern that analysts noted was the shift in how prisoners described the American soldiers guarding them. The early letters sometimes carried residue of the old contempt, the Americans are friendly but simple, that sort of formulation, which let a man maintain his hierarchy even in defeat. But as weeks passed, as prisoners moved deeper into the American interior, many were transported to camps across the continental United States. Far from any coast, the tone shifted. The guards were not simple. The country was not what they had imagined. A prisoner transported to a camp in the American Midwest wrote, in a phrase that has survived in records, that he had not understood what he was fighting against, not as an enemy, as a fact. That is an extraordinary sentence. It is the sentence of a man whose mental map has been redrawn. The transportation of prisoners deep into the American heartland was itself a psychological event, whether or not anyone intended it as one. German prisoners, riding by train through states they had never heard of, watched America pass outside the window. They saw cities. They saw farms, vast, organized, mechanized farms that bore no resemblance to the agricultural picture that wartime German propaganda had painted of a country in material decline. They saw highways and bridges and rail infrastructure on a scale that, for men who had fought across the supply-starved theaters of North Africa and the Eastern Front, must have registered as something close to science fiction. By 1943 and into 1944, there were prisoner of war camps scattered across more than 40 American states. The men in them came from the most capable military force Europe had produced in a generation, They were not naive. They were not easily impressed. And they were impressed. Some accounts describe prisoners requesting newspapers, American newspapers, which the camps sometimes provided as part of efforts to expose prisoners to democratic ideals. The newspapers carried advertisements. This detail sounds small until you hold it against the context. In wartime Germany, advertising had largely given way to rationing announcements and ideological content. An American newspaper full of advertisements for goods that were actually available, actually purchasable, carried within it a kind of argument that no speech could make as efficiently. The argument was simply, this country is not running out of anything. Imagine sitting with that. Imagine being a soldier who has been told for years that the enemy is decadent and weak, and then sitting in a camp in Kansas or Texas or Virginia reading an advertisement for refrigerators, while outside the window the American economy hums along, producing ships and planes and tanks at a rate that your own generals, in their most private moments, had begun to concede was beyond answering. The open loop that began with Ernst Miller's breakfast tray, that quiet, unsettling abundance, is paying off now. The unease was never about the food, it was about what the food proved. The soldier's experience was one register of the reckoning. The officer's experience was another, and in some ways more precise. German officers in American captivity, held separately from enlisted men, as convention required, had access to more information and possessed the analytical training to process it differently. Their post-war testimonies, and in some cases wartime correspondence, record a subtler but no less complete disintegration of the original confidence. Several German officers who passed through American captivity in 1943 and 1944 later wrote that the single most demoralizing aspect of the American system was not its fighting capacity, which they had come to respect through experience, but its organizational coherence. The Americans did not appear to be improvising. The camps were administered. The records were kept. The medical care was systematic. The food supply was regular. Behind every interaction with the American military machine was the sense of an institution that had thought about logistics before the emergency, rather than during it. This, for German officers who had watched their own supply system deteriorate, who had written requests for ammunition and fuel and received, in return, delays and partial fulfillments, and the bureaucratic static of an overstretched empire, was quietly devastating. One senior officer's post-war account described the American administrative system as the thing he most underestimated. He had expected American strength to be raw and blunt numbers and material, impressive but unsophisticated. He found instead that the numbers were matched by system, and that the system was the more frightening thing. Rommel's earlier assessment that the material disparity would decide the war was, by 1944, no longer an insight. It was consensus. German officers in captivity reached it sometimes slowly, sometimes in a single moment of clarity, but they reached it. And they tended to reach it not on the battlefield, where pride and training and the noise of combat could keep certain truths at bay, but here in the quiet of captivity, watching America administer itself. The title asks about a week. The truth, as the accounts make clear, is that there was rarely a single week. There was a process. But there were moments within that process that prisoners identified, later, as the hinge, the specific hour or meal or site that cracked the framework open. For many of the men captured in Tunisia in May 1943, that hinge came early. The processing was swift, the conditions were organized, and the contrast with their expectations was immediate and total. A belief system that had been years in the building, constructed from ideology and selective information and the natural human tendency to believe in the side you are fighting for, could, apparently, be structurally undermined in days. Not destroyed. Undermined, the distinction matters. These men did not, most of them, suddenly love America or renounce the cause in a clean, dramatic moment. What happened was quieter and more lasting. The mathematical certainty that had sustained them the sense that the war was still winnable, that the numbers could still come out right, simply became unavailable. They could no longer reach it. It had been replaced, not by despair exactly, but by a kind of flat, clear-eyed knowledge. Germany was going to lose. America was not what they had been told. And in captivity, with the evidence of that gap surrounding them on every side, the gap could no longer be talked around. This is the confession the title promises. Not a dramatic surrender of faith, a quiet, reluctant, almost clinical acknowledgement. We did not understand what we were fighting against. That sentence, in its variations, appears across the accounts. It is not the sentence of men who have been defeated in battle. It is the sentence of men who have been defeated in their understanding of the world. And that is a deeper thing to lose. After the war, some of these men returned to Germany. Some stayed in America, in a different kind of continuation of the strange story that captivity had begun. Some wrote about it. Some did not. What they carried home, those who carried anything articulable at all, was not, for the most part, bitterness at having been treated badly. The accounts of poor treatment in American captivity exist, and history requires acknowledging them. But the dominant note in the surviving record is something more complicated and more human, a kind of bewildered gratitude tangled up with a grief that had nothing to do with the captors. The grief was for the belief, for the years spent inside a certainty that turned out to be a construction, for the distance between what they had been told the world was and what the world, encountered directly, actually turned out to be. Ernst Miller, standing in that processing line in 1943, holding a tray that was heavier than he expected that moment, was not about food. It was about the first crack in a story he had been living inside. The crack would widen. It widened in kitchens and on train journeys and in camp newspapers and in conversations with American guards who treated him, in his own later telling, as a person rather than a symbol. This is what the war looked like from inside the loss. Not the Hollywood version of defeat, the dramatic collapse, the moment of reckoning, the clean catharsis. The real version. Slow, quiet, measured out in meals and mail, and the long, disorienting process of discovering that everything you built your certainty upon was, in the end, wrong. That is the one American thing that broke German morale. Not a weapon, not a battle. An undeniable, daily, material truth that could not be argued with, only absorbed. If that hit you the way it hits me every time I return to these accounts, the sheer human weight of it, then you already know this channel is something different. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. If this one stayed with you, leave it a like. It helps more people find these stories. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.